The E36 generation of BMW's much-loved 3 Series took the model even further upmarket with more refinement, more power, bigger engines and, in the case of the M3, Porsche 911 troubling performance. What's more, now they're out of their rough and ready cheap phase, they're appreciating as a modern classic, and when the weather's as gorgeous as this is, a convertible E36 is as nice as it gets. So here's everything that you need to know if you want to buy yourself a BMW E36 3 Series. But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition. E36s have been cheap for quite some time, and because they were a cheap way into a rear-wheel drive car, a lot of them have been driven hard by people who aren't necessarily used to a car stepping out at the back. A lot of them have been crashed, so look for any signs that your car has ended up in a ditch at some point. Mismatched paint, panel gaps not being straight, things like that. As for rust, well, most BMWs do, and the E36 is no exception. We'll start at the back. Rear arches is a particular weak spot on E36s. You want to check all the way around these rear arches, feel up in them down at the bottom edges where it meets the side skirts on the M Sport cars, here at the back where it meets the bumper, and obviously if the bumper's been off at any point, not put back on properly, this can chafe away the paint over time. That can then cause rust around here, which ultimately can spread beyond the rear wing into the rear bumper mount. Then that's going to rot and then your bumper could fall off, and that's not classy. M Sport cars have these rather nice side skirts on them, but again they're going to trap moisture and rot over the years. Look behind these, have a good feel behind them, make sure you've still got solid sills. Another flaw with E36s is leaky boots. It seems to affect pretty much all of them, no matter what body style, and it's usually a failure of the boot seal. So get the boot lid up, pull the seal off, look all the way around it, check the seal itself is still good with no splits in it and there's no rot on the metal, and obviously check in the boot, see if there's any signs that it's been letting damp in, things like damp stains on the carpets, that musty smell. The E36 has quite a cleverly designed underbelly where there are no visible seams in the chassis of the car. Chassis, this is a modern monocoque, but it's not uncommon for these cars to rot on the jacking spot. They get damaged over time as the car gets ham-fistedly jacked up, and of course that invites rust in. So jack the car up on all 4 of them, inspect each one of them carefully, make sure you trust them to be able to lift the car up. That's a serious weak spot for these cars. Also the seams, gradually the factory seam sealer can be flaked away and that will invite rot, and rot where the sills meet the floor is bad news. Another weak point is around the back of the sills where the rear trailing arms mount up. That can rot really easy, and if it does, the rear suspension's got nothing to mount to. Jack these cars up, don't take no for an answer, because the structure of them is really where they start to rot. But not just, it can rot cosmetically as well. The front wings, they're another common rot spot on E36s, and again, they'll go pretty much everywhere. And obviously these side skirts can trap moisture behind it and rot them out. These panels are not too expensive to replace, they're not too difficult to replace in the correct shade, but always budget it in. Most of the body kits on the M Sport cars like this are held on with brittle and quite fragile plastic clips. Give them a good wiggle, make sure nothing's flapping around, doesn't feel like it's going to come off, because if they are, it could just be shattered plastic clips, or it could be that the bit of metal they clip into is rotten, and again, serious work, complex metalwork stuff, so check it very carefully. One more spot to watch for rot, and that is the windscreen frame, particularly at the top here. If this gets damaged over time, stone chips and what have you, this rust bubbles up, it goes behind the windscreen seal and ultimately ends up in your interior, which ruins the trim, ruins the carpets, and can fry your electrics, of course, not to mention slowly rot the floor out, so check thoroughly. Headlights can fog up, very commonly, it's happened to this one unfortunately. You can take them apart and reseal them, but second-hand or brand new units are available, and the cabriolet cars have got a plastic rear window. Check that it's not split, check it's not leaking if the car's had a second roof fitted. Drive with the roof up. Are you getting wind whistle from anywhere? That could be failed seals or the roof not fitting properly. When the roof folds down, which you should be checking, make sure this window creases as it should. It should fold about halfway down neatly without coming apart at the seams. Again, if it's not, it's probably shrunk, and then you're into a new rear window at the very minimum, and that's at least a couple of £100 if you're not fitting it with someone else. The E36 came with a wide variety of engine choices, from the 1.6 four-cylinder up to the monstrous 3.2 straight six found in the later M3. Starting from 91 to 93, the six-cylinder petrol engines were the M50, and it's a durable, powerful, dependable unit if you look after it properly. But from 1994 onwards, BMW, like many manufacturers, switched to using Nikasil bore liners, and those cause issues. With particularly high sulphurous petrol, like we've got in the UK, over time those bore liners will break down and the engine will lose compression to the point where it won't even actually start anymore. Now, most of those Nikasil engines will have been replaced under warranty by now, and if it has, nothing to worry about. If your car is still on its original Nikasil liner engine, then broadly speaking, it's probably all right by now. Just put good quality petrol in it and don't do any short trips. Start it, drive it a mile and turn it off, because that will cause bore wash, and that is ultimately what eats away the Nikasil. From late 98 onwards, the M52 went back to steel bore liners, so if your car is in October 98 or later, you've got nothing to worry about on the Nikasil front. There's an easy check to see if your car has had its Nikasil liner engine replaced as well, with a little lug cast into the block just below the starter motor. On Nikasil liner cars, it's got an alloy casting on it, whereas on steel liner replacement engines, it's got a plate and a bolt on it. Have a good look, see what you can see. The four-cylinder engines in 1.6, 8 and 9 litre guys are revvy, keen, dependable units, and they're actually quite good fun to thrash around with. But their timing belt interval is just 30,000 miles, which is pretty low. They've also got plastic tensioners which come with their own set of problems, but these days you can get a more modern metal upgrade for that. On the six-cylinder engines, meanwhile, with the timing chain, that never really needs to be replaced. There's plenty of stories of these engines with 150, even 200,000 miles on their original timing chain. It's quite a good idea to replace the tensioner every 100,000 miles though, because that can get a little bit rattly and unpleasant. And talking of rattles, these engines are just generally a bit noisy. Even if all the valve clearances are good, even if the timing chain's fine, they do seem to rattle a little bit. But listen carefully, use your due diligence and make sure it's nothing more serious. 325i's built between 93 and 95 have what's called VANOS on the engine. It's a VVT that makes these cars really revvy and eager high up in the rev range. If you can hear a slight rattle from the front of the engine, or if the car's a bit sluggish at low speeds, it's probably a good sign that the VANOS pump needs rebuilding. Now, there are specialist services that can do that, and that will run you to about a few £100. You can get leaks from the cam cover. It's unsightly but not unfixable. About 15–20 quid will buy you a new gasket, and about half an hour will see it replaced and any leaks rectified. And similarly, you can end up with leaky sumps on these cars. Again, a new sump gasket isn't expensive or difficult to replace, but just make sure the sump itself isn't damaged, cracked or split. A rough idle or stumbling as you try and accelerate is probably down to split vacuum hoses. Don't forget, they're going to be 20, 25, 30 years old by now. They're going to have gone hard and brittle and cracked, and that will cause vacuum leaks. So have a good look at all the hoses in the engine bay, and similarly have a quick look at the fuel lines as well. E10 fuels can eat through them, and if your car's been run on E10, that could well be causing fuel leaks. The E36 is modern enough to have an OBD2 diagnostic port, so bring a code reader with you when you go and look at the car, plug it in, check for any codes, and then start, run and drive the car for a little bit, turn it off and check again, because if the seller has been unscrupulous enough to try and turn any warning lights off without actually fixing the problem, a scanner will reveal all. E36s with the larger engines can be hard on their engine mounts, so it's worth just physically grabbing the engine, giving it a wiggle, making sure it's in there solid, because if it's not, you'll get horrible vibrations. It will make the car unpleasant. Now, engine movement is doubly bad for the cooling systems. They're infamous on E36s because they're made out of plastic predominantly. We'll start with the radiators. The end kind of nozzle where the main radiator hose goes on is plastic, so over time it will get brittle, it'll crack, then you lose your coolant and your car overheats. Also, if your engine mounts are flogged out, the engine's going to move and it could snap the end off the radiator as well, which also isn't good. A common upgrade for these cars, even if you're not going to track it or race it, is an aluminium radiator. It's not susceptible to snapping like the plastic one is. Then there's the fan. Not uncommon for the blades to break off, so spin it all the way around, check all the blades are there and in one piece, and give the fan a good wobble. Make sure the viscous coupling's in good condition. As for gearboxes, you could get the E36 with either manual or automatics, and the manual box is quite a nice snicky short throw that we're used to for BMWs. If, however, it doesn't feel quite precise enough, or if the gear lever itself moves when you come off the throttle, it's probably a good sign that the gearbox mounts are worn out, but they are a bit easier to change than engine mounts, and they're not too expensive to rectify. The automatic gearbox, meanwhile, makes an E36 into a lovely cruiser. It's smooth, refined, and it kicks down willingly. If you're driving your car only short distances, it might feel like it's dragging out the gear changes a bit, or even flaring them. It's actually doing that by design. These cars do drag out the gear changes when they're cold to warm up the gearbox oil. So if you're only driving your car short distances, it'll never feel quite right. The auto box is also allegedly sealed for life, although we all know that that is rubbish. You want to be doing a gearbox oil change in these cars every 50 to 75,000 miles, and if you're not confident doing it at home, plenty of BMW specialists will do it for you. Keep it in good health and make these a lovely cruiser. E36 brakes are perfectly decent. Even on the lower spec 4-pot cars where you only get drums at the back, these cars do stop well. One common problem is the handbrakes though. They're infamously bad. The shoes really don't last on the cars with disc rear brakes where they've got shoes inside the disc and they glaze over with not very many miles or much age on them. But they're not that expensive to replace or difficult to do so. And a sign that yours are probably on the way out is that you have to keep adjusting the handbrake up to the point where the lever's almost vertical to get the car to hold itself. These cars have got ABS on them and very often they can throw up a warning light. It's just the sensors. They fail really easily, but they're not expensive to replace. About 12 quid. Turn the car off, turn it back on again and the light should have gone away. You should have your ABS back. It could be more serious though. The ABS control module is located on most E36s behind the glove box, and of course if your windscreen's leaking, like we said earlier, it's entirely possible that moisture could have got down in there and actually killed the ABS computer. That's going to be a little bit more expensive to replace, but they are doable. If your E36 isn't feeling responsive enough, it feels a bit saggy and a bit tired, there's a good chance first of all it's a high mileage example, and second of all it probably means the shock absorbers are just flogged out. These are quite heavy cars, they're hard on the suspension, particularly if you drive them aggressively, and a set of new shocks, even if you just go standard replacement, will transform the feel of the car. Bushes are also worth checking. These cars are very sensitive to worn out bushes that can tire over age, and again they will make the cars feel saggy, so have a good look at those as well. And if the car doesn't feel like it's tracking straight, there could be a fairly easy reason for that. A lot of towing companies use the rear trailing arms on E36s as lashing points. They're very easy to bend, and of course that knocks the tracking out of the rear of the car. So if you let go of the steering wheel and the car's wandering around, or it doesn't seem to like going over bumps where you're slightly turned, have a look at those rear trailing arms. If they're bent, it's probably why the car's been tied down on them. Much like the E46 that came after this, the more powerful E36s are known to actually crack their rear subframe mounts and their strut towers if they're driven particularly aggressively. So get the boot lid up, have a look under the carpet, check the structure of the metal under there, make sure there's no cracks or rot or any worrying damage there, because if they have and it is moving, your E36 is probably a scrapper. The E36 brought with it all kinds of new technology, including electronic climate control for the first time. As with any old luxury car though, you need to test everything. The air conditioning, the electric mirrors, the electric windows. A lot of the little finicky electrical parts for these cars are where you'll come unstuck with buying new ones. A common fault with pretty much all 90s BMWs is the LCD screens in the gauge cluster. The pixels can go dead. You can get it rebuilt professionally. It'll probably come to about a couple of £100. The electric windows on these cars should drop a little bit when you open the doors and then raise back up about ½ an inch when you shut it again. Now if they're not doing that, that's a good sign that your window regulators are on the way out. You can buy replacements. On post-95 cars, it's not uncommon for the ignition barrel to spin in the plastic trim to the point where you can't actually click the car on because it won't stay still. The pretty much accepted fix for this is just to wind a tiny self-tapper through it from behind to keep it in place. It sounds a bit bodgy, but do it carefully and subtly and it really needn't be an issue. Another plastic failure can be with the switches, the headlight switches specifically. Make sure when you click it, there's a definite clicking action. Gradually the little notches in there can wear out to the point where you can't choose between your side lights and your headlights. On manual cars, a squeaky clutch pedal is not uncommon. It's usually a worn bush, which is cheap to replace, but it will involve basically folding yourself under the dash to do so, so make your mind up whether you want to live with that or not. And finally, you want to check in the boot. Most 90s BMWs come with one of these in the boot lid, an included factory BMW toolkit with all kinds of bits like spanners, screwdrivers and even a set of pliers. Check this is there when you go and view the car, because if it is, that's a nice bonus, and if it's not, it's a good bargaining tool. Time was an E36 was pretty much the cheapest way into a rear-wheel drive car, and that means that a lot of them have been used, abused and modified as track cars or drift cars. But those days are long gone, and any survivors of those rough modified cars are best avoided. They are never going to be economical to bring back to a nice state. The cheapest way into an E36 is the often forgotten compact, the short wheelbase version. You can get into a roadworthy example of a compact from under £2,000, and they're still a great fun car for the money. Coupes and saloons are a bit more expensive and they start over £2,000, nearer £3,000. Estates and cabriolets command a bit of a premium though. They tend to start around £3,000, and if you want a 6-cylinder engine in there, you can push a bit closer to £4,000. Add a manual gearbox into the equation and you're talking around about another £500 on top of that. If you're not after a project and you just want a nice example to use right now though, you're going to start around £4,000 for a good, tidy example of a coupe or a saloon, and around £5,000 upwards for a convertible or an estate. And from there, the prices on E36s have plateaued, much like a lot of modern classics do. The best examples of an E36 with a 6-cylinder engine on the market can cost you anywhere between £8,000 and £12,000 at the moment. If only that top spec M3 will do for you though, you're going to start your search at around 12 grand. But we've seen E36 M3s transact at dealers for as much as double that. But an E36 M3 is a car to spend a lot on now, but you will probably get it back and then some when the time comes to sell. Whichever one you buy though, the E36 is a great choice. These are comfortable, reliable, fun to drive cars, and whichever one you choose, yeah, it pretty much is the ultimate driving machine.
This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.